Amazing Couples by Victor Yup and Doris Monk. Chapter 2. Enjoy fortune together, endure misfortune together. Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 to chapter 13 verse 1. Larry's barn burned down and Susan, his wife, called the insurance company. Susan told the insurance company, "We had that barn insured for $50,000 and I want my money." The agent replied, "Whoa there, just a minute, Susan. It doesn't work quite like that. We will ascertain the value of the old barn and provide you with a new one of comparable value." Susan replied after a pause, "Then I'd like to cancel the policy on my husband." Even people of faith fail for lack of courage, conviction, and commitment, making poor decisions and suffering untold consequences in the process. Abraham, the father of all who believe, Romans 4:11, was faithless on one occasion. He almost lost his family if not for God's faithfulness. Someone has said, 3 things in life make a man: hard work, sincerity, and commitment. If that is true, Abraham failed miserably. He could not tough it out in uncertain or harsh economic times. He was not sincere with the neighbors and foreigners he met, and had no commitment to his wife in real or perceived threatening circumstances. Someone has said, "Desperate times call for desperate measures." But I beg to differ. Desperate times need not lead to the path of deceit, disloyalty, and dishonesty. How do married couples rise above desperate times? What if riches, resources, and reserves are lacking? What do they need to do to hold on to the family? First, desperate times call for dogged determination. Genesis chapter 12, verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. A young man, a Christian, went to an older believer to ask for prayer. "Will you please pray that I may be more patient?" he asked. The aged saint agreed. They knelt together, and the man began to pray. "Lord, send this young man tribulation in the morning, send this young man tribulation in the afternoon, send this young man—" At that point, the young Christian blurted out, No, I didn't ask you to pray for tribulation. I wanted you to pray for patience." "Ah," responded the wise Christian, "it's through tribulation that we learn patience." Someone has said, pain is nothing compared to the emptiness that comes from quitting. Every couple enjoys their fair share of fortune and suffers their fair share of misfortune like any other couple. An article published several years ago in USA Today about what most people say are the most difficult things to manage in the households still rings true today. 26% of the respondents said finances were the most difficult to manage. 21% claimed household members' schedule was at fault. 20% blamed communication with family and friends. 17% attribute chaos in the family to household chores and errands, and still 17% said others. After Abram and Sarai had settled in Canaan, external and internal forces soon bore down on them. Abram and his family and their entourage were on the right track initially, but a famine, verse 10, sidetracked them. A famine is an environmental and agricultural downturn and meltdown at its worst. Abram's confidence in God's guidance and provision was shaken. Canaan, not Egypt, was the promised land. They were supposed to be in Canaan, verse 5, but after dropping anchor there, they panicked and fled to Egypt at the first sign of trouble, verse 10. The same Hebrew equation for the famine was severe reappears one other time in Genesis 43:1, characterizing the early days of the famine in Joseph's time, a few chapters later at its worst when it became very severe, Genesis 47:13. The Hebrew word very is missing from NIV. The famine was as severe a test as any. God had commended Abram and promised the land to his offspring, Genesis 12:7. In response, the patriarch built 2 altars, verses 7 to 8, to mark the occasion, to pay his homage, and to sink his roots. However, Abram intended to stay in good times and flee in bad or lean times. God specifically commanded Abram while he was in Haran, verse 1, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you." And again, when Abram arrived in Canaan, God said, "To your offspring I will give this land." Verse 7. The Lord gave no instructions to Abram when the famine struck, but Abram took God's silence as permission to leave. The interesting thing was that the famine did more damage than the Canaanites did. Verse 6. The natives could not scare Abram away, but the famine did the job. Verse 7. The aging Abram, verse 4, probably thought staying was too much to ask of him at his age. Left to his own judgment, Abram's survival instincts took over and he acted out of fear, not in faith. He failed to seek God's presence, his will, and guidance, even though commentators like Derek Kidner felt it is unrealistic to regard Egypt as forbidden territory to God's people at this stage. He, however, said, in a famine, it might well seem a providence that Egypt was nearby, watered by the flooding of the Nile. Yet all the indications are that Abram did not stop to inquire, but went on his own initiative, taking everything into account but God. The grass was literally greener on the Egyptian side. Abram was determined to leave his options open and opened the back door in his commitment to God. It was not too hard to convince himself that it was a selfless move. He did it all for the sake of others, including his family and servants, or so he thought. Second, desperate times call for dependable character. Genesis chapter 12, verses 11 to 16. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, "I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you." When Abram came to Egypt, the Egyptians saw that she was a very beautiful woman. And when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, and Abram acquired sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, men servants and maid servants, and camels. There was a man who traveled the 7 continents searching for a rare bird. The bird was special because it could speak 5 languages. The man found the bird in a pet store on the other side of the world. He told the owner to have it shipped to his house. When he finally arrived home from his travels, he said to his wife, "Dear, did the bird come?" She smiled and answered, "Yes." He then asked, "Well, where is it?" She replied, "It's in the oven." "You've got to be kidding," he said in disbelief. "You put that bird in the oven? Don't you know that bird can speak 5 different languages?" Unimpressed, his wife curtly replied, "Then why didn't it speak up?" Abram was a selfish pig who did not speak up when he ought to have done so, not for his wife or to Pharaoh. His fears were justified, but being self-serving and selfish was not. He thought he was smart and savvy when he asked his beautiful wife, Sarai, to feign as his sister. Sarai was Abram's wife and sister from a different mother, Genesis 20:12, but she was Abram's wife by marriage legally and his sister only technically. The Hebrew word for beautiful, verse 11, also describes Rachel, Genesis 29:17, Abigail, 1 Samuel 25:3, 2 Tamars, 2 Samuel 13, verse 1 and 14, verse 27, Abishag, 1 Kings 1:4, and Esther, Esther 2:7. Abram was 75 then, verse 4, and Sarai was 10 years younger, Genesis 17:17, at a stunning 65. Abram's calculations backfired from the start. Not only did he not value her as his wife, also he did not know her value. As it turned out, Sarai was not only beautiful, she was very beautiful, verse 14, in the eyes of the Egyptians. Sarai was not only one of the magnificent 7 beauties of the Old Testament, she was the head of the class. Only she and Abishag, 1 Kings 1:4, qualified as very beautiful in Hebrew, but the young Abishag, 1 Kings 1:2, was very beautiful in her prime. In contrast, Sarai was still very beautiful past her prime. Abram suspected from day one what the Egyptians would see in Sarai and how dangerous it would be for his neck. The word when, verse 12, is comprised of 2 Hebrew words, and it will be and that, not if. He did not doubt it would happen, neither did he question if he could live without her, how to live without her, or how the Egyptians, plural, would respond. His answer to the "your wife or your life" threat was obvious without saying. The only thing left unanswered in his mind was who would take her. Verse 12 reveals that he predicted what the Egyptians would see in his wife and what they would say about her and what they would do to her husband if she was married. When push came to shove, he let others take his wife away, verse 15, without a fight, a word, or a murmur. How pathetic. At that point, Abram could still sweep Sarai off her feet, say no to such risks, and brave the Canaan famine together. In truth, migrating to Egypt was worse than staying in Canaan. Famine in the promised land was replaced by famine in the human heart. Wittingly or otherwise, Abram uttered a self-fulfilling prophecy when he said, "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake." The Hebrew verb "treated well" reappeared in the most curious and suspicious circumstances when Pharaoh later treated well Abram. The Hebrew text said he had sheep and cattle, male and female donkeys, menservants and maidservants, and camels. Verse 16, anything but his wife. In other words, he had part of what Pharaoh had, but Pharaoh had all that he had. He was richer in things, but poorer in life and empty at home. He gambled big and lost everything. Either Pharaoh helped Abram to be rich, or Abram helped himself to become rich. Third, desperate times call for dignified response. Genesis chapter 12, verses 17 to chapter 13, verse 1. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. So Abram went up from Egypt to Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. A woman came out of her house and saw 3 old men with long white beards sitting in her front yard. She did not recognize them. She said, "I don't think I know you, but you must be hungry. Please come in and have something to eat." "Is the man of the house home?" they asked. "No," she replied, "he's out." "Then we cannot come in," they replied. In the evening, when her husband came home, she told him what had happened. "Go tell them I am home and invite them in." The woman went out and invited the men in. "We do not go into a house together," they replied. "Why is that?" she asked. One of the old men explained. "His name is Wealth," he said, pointing to one of his friends, and said, pointing to another one, "He is Success, and I am Love." Then he added, "Now go in and discuss with your husband which one of us you want in your home." The woman went in and told her husband what was said. Her husband was overjoyed. "How nice," he said. "Since that is the case, let us invite wealth. Let him come and fill our home with wealth." His wife disagreed. "My dear, why don't we invite success?" Their daughter-in-law was listening from the other corner of the house. She jumped in with her own suggestion. "Would it not be better to invite love? Our home will then be filled with love." "Let us heed our daughter-in-law's advice," said the husband to his wife. "Go out and invite love to be our guest." The woman went out and asked the 3 old men, "Which one of you is Love? Please come in and be our guest." Love got up and started walking toward the house. The other 2 also got up and followed him. Surprised, the lady asked Wealth and Success, "I only invited Love. Why are you coming in?" The old men replied together, "If you had invited Wealth or Success, the other 2 of us would have stayed out. But since you invited Love, wherever he goes, we go with him. Wherever there is love, there is also wealth and success." Only divine intervention could save Abram and Sarai at this point when Abram refused to speak up and stand up for Sarai. The Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household, verse 17, to protect Sarai. This is the only biblical instance of reported serious diseases or great plagues in Hebrew. Not even the plagues on Egypt in Moses' era could top that. Moses' plagues were primarily plagues, Exodus 11:1, with no superlatives attached. Poor Sarai. She was almost exchanged for beasts and servants by the passive Abram, who did nothing. She was not invited, but taken. Taken not for a foreign dignitary, but a foreign wife, but not as a house guest, but a palace concubine. Further, her weak, passive, and cowardly husband was not going back to get her no matter what. No plan was made to climb the castle, tie a rope, lower the maiden, and make a getaway. Abram sacrificed his wife on the altar of self-preservation. The text calls Sarai his wife, verses 11 and 12, Abram's wife, verse 17, and your wife, verse 18 and 19, in contrast to Abram's assertion of Sarai being my sister, verses 13 and 19. Incredibly and ironically, Pharaoh was more honorable, if not more righteous, than the father of faith. Note that Pharaoh did not utter the "your wife or your life" threat. Abram willingly tabled the offer, "my honey for your money." Also, Pharaoh knew he had incurred divine wrath even when Abram was clueless. Pharaoh had to figure out what he had gone wrong in his kingdom and arrive at a conclusion on his own. The text indicated Abram was speechless in the midst of a crisis of epic proportions when he had a chance to speak up. Further, Pharaoh summoned Abram. Abram did not call on him. Someone has said, not admitting a mistake is a bigger mistake. Sarai was not as guilty as Abram, but she was not innocent either and did not get off scot-free. Someone noted that Sarai, not Abram, told the lie to Pharaoh. Abram was the supplier, but Sarai was the swindler. One of the maidservants they picked up in Egypt, verse 16, Hagar the Egyptian, was to be Sarai's constant menace, her thorn in the flesh, her rival for her husband's attention and to the family name and fortune. The trip south unleashed a genie out of a bottle that refused to be bottled up again. Out of Hagar's womb came Ishmael, the father of the Arabs. Genesis 25:12-13. As a result, the fierce conflict between the Israelites and the Arabs remains unabated today. Conclusion. Helen Keller said, "Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure." On another occasion, she said, "Character cannot be developed in ease and quiet. Only through experience of trial and suffering can the soul be strengthened, ambition inspired, and success achieved." Have you been faithful, devoted, true, and loyal to your spouse? Do not hang your spouse out to dry, compromise at your spouse's expense, or put God to the test. God puts the husband as the head of the house to make godly and God-pleasing decisions, and the wife as his helper to remind him to be more Christ-like, not to be more like himself or more like her. Men, have you been the good, godly, and gallant husband God has intended you to be? Bible study questions. Warm up. Has your family encountered a crisis to the point that you, or your spouse, have to make a sacrifice? Was it voluntary or suggested by the other half? Group study. 1. List the main characters in the passage. How are they related to one another? 2. What promise did God make to Abram for the place he was heading? Verse 3. Did God protect Abram as he had promised? What was Abram's request to Sarai? Verses 11 to 13. What did Abram receive in exchange for Sarai? Verse 16. 3. When did the incident with Abram, Sarai, and Pharaoh take place? At what stage of Abram's life did this happen? 4. Where did Abram's travel take him? Verses 5 to 9. Where was the promised land? 5. Why did Abraham travel to Egypt? Verse 10. Why did he not build an altar and call on God? Why did Abraham call Sarai his sister? Discuss whether this was legitimate. Why did God inflict plagues on Pharaoh? Verse 17. 6. How did Abraham deal with difficulties? Verses 10 to 13. How did God intervene in the crisis of Abraham and Sarai? Verse 17. The gain and loss of Abram and Sarai from this episode. Progression. 1. The progress in Abram's relationship with God from the day they were called to leave their home. 2. The progress in Abram's relationship with God when a famine or crisis struck. Reflection. Abraham repeated the sin in Genesis 20. In Genesis 20:13, his faith wavered in that he used his own method to solve the problems and crises he faced in the outside world upon leaving home, failing to trust God fully. In the end, he learned to depend on God to overcome his weaknesses, becoming the father of faith. What weaknesses do you need to overcome in God's strength? From a psychologist's desk. Life has its fair share of difficulties and challenges. In marriage, we can face them together with our spouses and learn to grow. But if a crisis is not handled with care, it may also rock our marriage. See some of the stresses of life listed in the Holmes and Ray Life Stress Scale. Source: Wikipedia.com. What have you and your spouse encountered? Do these experiences allow you to grow together or create tension in your marriage relationship? Tips on how to face a crisis. 1. Begin with prayer. As far as possible, pray together, wait on the Lord, rely on Him and seek Him. But do not use prayer to convince your spouse or for teaching purposes. If the relationship is tense or if there is a difference of opinion, begin with praying alone, quieting oneself before God. Ask God for a united heart. 2. Listen to each other's view of the difficulties as well as the strategies for solving problems. Listening is the most important. If the discussion is not helpful, write down your thoughts. After everyone has calmed down, then objectively analyze each other's point of view. The process of listening is very important, not merely listening to the content. Listening to each other's feelings is more important. 3. Following the principles of the Bible, choose the best strategy. 4. Even if there is no good solution, mutual understanding and empathy are the most important. 5. Seek the support of brothers and sisters in prayer. Couples sharing. Reflect on a crisis you as a couple have experienced. Did you pray together for God's help? Did you follow the Bible's teaching or principles to resolve the crisis? What was the difficulty? Do you have a difference of opinion? How did you resolve it? What was the process? Who had to make a sacrifice in the crisis? Was it from one party or both parties? Group sharing. Share what you have learned with other couples so that they can use the experience to deal with future crises. Brothers, discuss how husbands can protect their wives in a crisis. Sisters, discuss how wives can submit to their husbands and support them in a crisis.